The United States and Europe have one of the most complex relationships in international relations. While closely tied together as integral parts of the West, they have often had a difficult relationship. While the United States is central to European security, the two have very different outlooks. They're also competitors in certain areas, such as trade and economics. All this has become even more acute under the Trump administration. So, how does the United States understand Europe, and how should Europeans understand America? And where does the relationship now stand, and where could it go? To discuss all this, I'm joined by journalist and analyst Dave Keating. Widely regarded as one of the leading reporters on EU affairs, he brings a unique perspective on the issues as an American who is now the Brussels correspondent of France 24. So, hi, Dave. Thanks so much for joining us. Obviously, it's a huge topic to talk about US EU relations, but I think maybe one of the things that would be really interesting to start with is to give some sort of inside perspective on that relationship, because I think you've got it's a very complex relationship. These are meant to be sort of nominal allies. We talk about the West, and obviously European countries and the United States are fundamental parts of that. And yet it's a relationship that's always had a certain degree of tension in there, for example, over trade. But it'd be really interesting to hear, as an American who's got so much experience of dealing with Europe, how have the two sides traditionally spoken to each other? A little bit before we'll move on to Trump later, but traditionally, how has that relationship been?
Yeah, I grew up in the US, but I moved to Europe 20 years ago, first to London and then other various places. And so it's been really interesting to see how people on either side view each other. Certainly, one side is watching the other side much more than vice versa. So Europeans, their relationship with America is kind of like an imperial relationship, I would say, because they are so culturally overwhelmed by the American culture that they view and participate in on a daily basis, that it can sometimes feel to them like they're living in the outer sections of an American empire. And it's interesting because for me, moving here to Europe, it was kind of like my cultural existence kept existing as it did before. So if you were Italian and you moved to the United States, if you wanted to keep following Italian culture, keeping up with Italian news, you wouldn't be able to talk to Americans about that. You would have to call up your mother. You'd have to find some videos on YouTube. For me as an American, it's a little weird because it's always kind of felt like I never left, because Europe is kind of part of this American cultural sphere. You turn on the radio, you're going to hear an American song. You turn on the TV, you're going to see an American television show. That creates a kind of unequal relationship, I'd say, between Europeans and Americans, because Americans, I can tell you from growing up there, we don't see a lot of the outside world. Kind of like a fishbowl. Everyone can see inside, but no one can see outside. So we don't get a lot of culture from the outside world. We don't see a lot of foreign movies. Most Americans, I would say, has never seen a foreign movie in their lives. We get very little music even from outside the country. So we're kind of self-contained in the US. But at the same time, we're being watched. Everything that America consumes is being consumed by the world, and particularly in Europe. And you mentioned, this is called an alliance, and these are called allies. I think a more accurate description would be protectorates, that these are European countries are really controlled by the United States in three ways. Economically, starting from the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods system, and to all of the payment platforms we could talk about today. Also militarily, obviously through the NATO protectorate, European countries not being able to defend Europe without the United States, and culturally, that Europe kind of almost really depends on importing American culture now. You can't imagine this continent without American culture. So those three things, to me, have always made this less of an alliance and more of a protectorate. And I see that in my daily life in the 20 years I've lived here, because people always want to ask me about the United States. They always want to talk about American politics. They always want to talk about their favorite American TV shows, American movies. When I'm back home in the US, nobody's asking me about Europe. I mean, people I know in the US, they don't even know where Brussels is. They just don't care. So I think that is one thing that Europeans really don't understand is that it's not a two-way relationship, and it's definitely not a two-way relationship in terms of the level of interest. Americans really do not care about that.
I was going to ask you about what Americans get wrong about Europe, but the problem is you sort of rather said, well, they just don't think about it. But I, I guess that says so much in itself. But there must be this sort of sense of how does the United States view the European Union, because it is this very, very strange beast that is it's actually remarkably difficult for many Europeans to understand. And obviously I'm British by background, and one of the problems I had was, and it's amazing to think it was almost a decade ago, was at the time of the EU referendum. I was working at the LSE at the time. I was based at the European Institute, one of the leading centres in Britain, if not Europe, on European studies. And it was remarkable just how little even the British people knew about Europe. But how do Americans that are more engaged understand the European Union and that relationship between the European Union and member states? And I'm guessing, coming from a federal system like the US, that there is that sort of tendency to want to make some sort of approximation, which I don't think, work terribly well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have the same experience when I lived in London from 2006 to 2010, that I was shocked by how even well-educated British people working in the political realm knew absolutely nothing about how essentially their federal level of governance works. It was quite surprising to me when I arrived. I think in continental Europe, it's only marginally better. I think you're right that Europeans, they're just not taught basic civics about how this level of government works. And it is one level of government. It's not a United Nations. The thing, so in the US, Americans, they really know nothing about the EU, but the impression that they have of it, and I'm including, educated Americans here, is that it is a United Nations for Europe. In fact, I've heard that phrase used several times over the years. I speak to visiting journalism students, grad school and undergrad students who I think it's an EU funded trip. They come and they learn about what the European Union is. They're all American. I meet them for one dinner each of these trips, and they always tell me they basically they did not understand that this was a confederal system, that it makes laws. Like, they actually didn't realize that the European Union has a legislature. They thought that what they know is the summits, right? They see in the news all the prime ministers and presidents gathering for the European Council summits, and it looks something like maybe the UN General Assembly, and they think that's what it is. So that, let's say, for those Americans that do know that there is an EU legislature, I think there's still very, very little understanding of how those laws are made. Because usually when I talk to Americans, I explain it using the parallels of the American federal system. And I actually think it works quite well, because you have a bicameral legislature, essentially the council, which is made up of representatives of the member states, which is what the US Senate was originally. Senators weren't directly
Mm.
elected, they were chosen by the state governments. And then you have the lower house, the European Parliament, directly elected by the people. So it actually resembles the American government of 150 years ago, before senators started being directly elected. And then you have the executive branch. There's key differences in that in the US system, it's the legislature that proposes legislation and the executive can veto it. In the EU, the executive proposes it, and then the legislature amends it or decides whether or not it will pass. But I find that if you describe it in this way, where you have these branches of government, the legislative process works its way through in all the different forms. I think that the Court of Justice of the EU is quite similar to the Supreme Court. So you can explain it in that way. And because Americans are familiar with the federal system, they can kind of get this pretty quickly, much quicker than a British person or a French person or somebody from a unitary state who doesn't understand the basic concept of federalism. Particularly British people seem to struggle with this, in my opinion, in my experience. Whereas somebody from Germany, somebody from Austria, I think even somebody from Spain is more accustomed to this idea of, states do one thing and your federal level of government do another thing. Um, Because this is actually one area where I think Europeans misunderstand the United States. They think it's much more centralized than it is. If you look at the
Mm.
split between the laws that come from your state and the laws that come from the federal government, it's something pretty equal to the split between member states and the EU. In Europe, a lot of law comes from the individual states, but they don't get a lot of media attention. And that's been an increasing phenomenon in the US, that the media, even local media, only focuses on national politics, doesn't focus on the state capitals, state politics, where there are full legislatures making laws for people that no one knows about because they're not following it. It's kind of the inverse of the problem that we have in the European Union. But because it doesn't get a lot of media attention, Europeans kind of don't know it exists. So I think that Europeans, in trying to understand the US and how it can be similar to the EU, you have that double block where A, Europeans, most of them are not from federal countries, so they don't really understand the concept, and B, they don't understand actually how federal the United States is and how it works very differently from their national governments.
Where it becomes fascinating is when I've spoken with Americans and sort of talked about it, is the role of the governors of the states and how it would be if the United States had a more formalized process that all the governors would come together, for example, on
Which would
every
be the
6
European
months.
Council, the equivalent of the
Yeah,
European Council.
exactly. To talk about how is our vision for the future of the United States. And, it's a really fascinating sort of think that if the United States had a model like that, how that would translate into sort of cohesion and things. Because of course, as you more than aware and seeing is that across Europe, there are differences between the political complexions of governments, and they have to work. Some countries at some point will be sort of more right leaning, some will be more left leaning, but they've got to somehow navigate a way of consensus to try and reach some sort of model for the future.
Yeah, I think
But
it's interesting too, because the US originally, before the new constitution was written, they originally had a confederal constitution that much more resembled what the EU has today. And you think about, like, how would the US be different if you had this kind of a system where the upper house of legislature was governors, let's say, like in
mm,
the EU. And I especially think often is, what if you had to get the unanimous consent of all 50 of the US state governors in order to adopt a US foreign policy position? Do you think the US would be in the position it is right now? No. I mean, it's just so blatantly an absurd thing that the EU has in terms of those unanimity requirements. And, the governor thing, I think it just very quickly demonstrates to people how absurd the situation is.
yeah. I never thought of it that way, but absolutely. If Mississippi and California and Rhode Island all had to agree on a common foreign policy position, and forcing them to have to sort of think in those terms, I mean, it'd be amazing to think, yes, how very different things would be. But in terms of, I mean, for example, when it comes to things like trade, and we know that there is this sort of, as you said, a protectorate relationship that exists in security, but trade is very different, and the economic side of things, you know Europe is a bit of a beast in that way. And I mean, one of the things that I would often sort of talk about is the Brussels effect, which is this idea that the EU is such an important actor now in terms of setting standards for products, that countries naturally have to conform to those regulations in order to be able to trade. And this is one of the arguments, in Brexit, that Britain gave up its ability to make those rules, but still has to now take them. Um, so that seems to be an area where, would it be right to say that there's sort of far more equal, or if not, maybe the EU is a bit stronger than the United States? And again, we'll talk about Trump in just a sec.
Well, yeah, this is always the argument that's made, that the EU is a larger single market than the United States. It's become the world's regulator as the US has kind of stepped back from regulation. The EU has stepped in to fill the void. Mario Draghi had some very interesting comments on this in his two speeches over the course of August, where he said basically the assumption of the EU side has been this huge market of 450 million people, and this regulatory juggernaut would automatically give the EU heft on the world stage and make it an equal to the United States. And what Draghi said is, we can see over the past summer that did not work. The European Union completely caved to Donald
Mm.
Trump's extortion in this trade war. And all of these decades of building this single market in the European Union just blew up overnight, thanks to Ursula von der Leyen signing a surrender deal with the United States at the request of all of our national leaders here in Europe. It really demonstrated that as long as the US militarily controls Europe, that economic power is meaningless in terms of power dynamics. Um, and so that's the core of the problem there. I think also we have to keep in mind that even if, I mean, look, as recently as 2011, the EU and the US had equal GDP in nominal terms. In fact, the EU was a little bit higher in terms of GDP. Since then, in nominal terms, the GDP of the EU has fallen. On PPP, it's about the same. But we're really talking about an economy that is equal to the United States, but it's an economy that's using the structure of America, an American controlled structure. Just one example, our payment platforms here in Europe are completely controlled by the United States. We don't have a sovereign way to pay each other electronically here in Europe. We use Visa, MasterCard, or we
Mm.
use PayPal. All of those are systems that the United States could just turn off overnight, and we would be actually unable to pay each other. So this economic success that Europe has built has been on the back of American infrastructure and also controlled by American infrastructure. If Europeans stop and think about what they do on a daily basis, how many of those things are controlled by the United States? Every time they make a payment with a credit card, every time they log on to social media, every time they use Microsoft. I mean, just these basic companies that are American. So in the end, yes, Europe has built a very strong regulatory structure and a strong economy, but when it's on the basis of an infrastructure controlled by the United States, Europe can never really get power through that economic success. And even when it comes to the regulation, we saw in the text that they finally released from the von der Leyen Trump deal that the EU has already committed to revising 3 pieces of its climate legislation, seemingly. I mean, the wording is very vague, and also on its transport legislation. So if we're now in a situation where the US is going to use its military and economic control over Europe in order to effectively have a veto over EU regulation, I mean, we might as well pack up and go home. Why do we have a European Union? So it's been a very, very troubling summer, which, as Mario Draghi pointed out, has been a wake-up call for Europe that you cannot build a behemoth on economic power alone.
So, I mean, you raised so many fascinating questions there, and I know that you've been touring around Europe this summer to get views from the capital. But perhaps before talking about what you've heard there, is how have the institutions in Brussels responded to the Trump presidency? Have there been tensions with the member states? Have they got a very clear vision for what they would like to be doing? But now, going back to what we're talking about how the EU is structured in this rather unusual way, is that European federal executive saying we want to take a particular approach and finding that challenge by the member states? And how are they talking about it in the Parliament, in the Commission?
Well, obviously, Europeans wasted a lot of time between 2016 and now. I mean, the first time Trump was elected, there was real panic. I was living in Berlin at that time, and within the German political realm, there was this absolute panic. In the end, in that first term, there were kind of adults in the room. The Republican institutions were able to put the guardrails around Trump in a way that didn't make things completely go off the rails. And then, of course, you had Joe Biden elected in 2020. And so Europeans were like, "Phew, thank God we don't have to try to do anything for ourselves. Now everything's back to normal." So they didn't do anything in these past 8 years to build a more sovereign Europe, and they were just la la la. They wanted to ignore the fact that there was an attempted coup, an insurrection. As it got more and more likely last year that Donald Trump was going to be elected, and he was outright promising to be a dictator, outright promising things that would fundamentally change what America is permanently forever. Europeans did not want to talk about it. That's in terms of the politicians in Brussels. Now, of course, we have the presidency starting. Institutionally, you have a split, of course. The European Parliament is always the more ambitious of the EU government branches. And so they're saying the EU needs to stand up to Trump. The signature of that trade deal was extremely unpopular among MEPs. In national governments, they asked her to do it. They asked von der Leyen to do this. And they came back, oh, yeah, the optics aren't very good, but we really had no choice. And we can't start a trade war with the United States. So in the council, which is the national governments, it's extremely cautious. They don't even want to talk about this subject. They're kind of living in permanent denial. They they're they seem to be living in a world that is not the one we actually inhabit. In terms of the commission, I mean, they prepared this retaliatory trade action. It was ready to go, but then the instruction from the national governments was clearly, "Don't use it. We're just going to surrender." And that came from Chancellor Merz. I mean, he's been very confusing on this because at first, when he was elected, he was talking all tough about the United States, and but he can say whatever he wants, and he's been saying all of this stuff that sounds tough, but then he's actually rolling over and surrendering in every single thing he's done since he came into office. And he is the chief voice in Ursula von der Leyen's ear. If he wanted Europe to stand up and stand up for itself and not give in to the extortion, Europe wouldn't be giving into the extortion. So it's a denialism still, and it is an inertia, because now the challenge is so clear and so dramatic and so dangerous that I think European leaders are just frozen. They don't know what to do because every option is a bad option, and so they're just not doing anything.
And I mean, that brings me to the fact that, you have been using this summer to tour around Europe and hear different things from the different capitals. I mean, you sort of painted a sort of broad picture of sort of the European leaders are obviously very cautious. But how have you seen differences across those capitals or across those different countries talking to people? What are the standouts that you see from different countries?
Yeah, really what I wanted to do was talk to average people, so people who are
Mm.
not following politics, because I've found over the years it's really important to get out of the Brussels bubble, because you can get a totally wrong impression of what people are thinking if you stay in that bubble. Brussels people are particular, let's say. People are really not aware of what's going on. I mean, so many people I've been talking to are planning trips to the US. I mean, my whole 20 years here, whenever I say I'm from the US, about half the time people are like, "Oh my God, so amazing. Why would you move here to Europe? It's my dream to live in the US." It makes smoke come out of my ears. I get like the quality of life here is so much better. I can't understand why Europeans would still want to be moving to the United States, especially when it is going in such a dangerous direction. And I think is really primed for civil war within the next couple of years. Maybe that's a different topic. So I'm still hearing this enthusiasm for America as people still entering themselves in the green card lottery as if it's some kind of prize to live in the United States. And when I talk about, oh, what's going on there, doesn't that make you nervous? It's like it's a TV show. Like they're seeing it, let's only on social media, because these aren't people who are really following the news. So they're seeing it pop up on their social media feeds. They see what Trump is doing, but it's almost like it flips into something that they're watching, and that probably says something about the social media age that we're living in.
Mm.
People couldn't seem to make a connection between what they're seeing happening in the United States and the idea that they should change anything about how they're living, about how their politicians here in Europe should be handling things, or even something as basic as changing their vacation plans, like maybe going to Canada instead of the US, or going anywhere else than a country which is really, really hurtling towards something catastrophic. So definitely the magnitude of what is unfolding before our eyes here has not hit them. And when I lay out some of the possibilities to them, well, we're looking at a situation that is more and more authoritarian every day. We're already there. We're not talking about some possible prospect in the future. The US is already, the institutions of American life have all crumbled before Donald Trump. We are entering an authoritarian era in the United States. and that could go very, very dangerously wrong and result in a civil war. They act like snakes are coming out of my head. Like it's such a remote possibility for them because they've grown up their whole lives with the United States as this bedrock of stability, as this shining city on a hill that they've been taught to worship their whole lives. And so it's just not computing in the European brain that things are going so off the rails. Even though they're watching it on their screens,
Mm.
it's like they can't connect that America to the America that they're thinking about and making plans about and this type of thing. So the danger that we're facing, the danger for the domestic situation in the US and the danger of the direct threat that the United States presents to Europeans now is just not registering with average people. I'll give an example. I was on the island of Chios in Greece a couple weeks ago, and this American family came in, and the dad was wearing a "Make America Great" hat again, "Make America Great Again" hat, and they sat at the table next to us, and I was with Europeans, and I looked around at the restaurant, and to me, this would be like living in the 1930s and having somebody come in with one of those swastika armbands. I was reminded of the scene in Cabaret, the movie, where they're out having a picnic and they're kind of forgetting about the state of the world. And then all of a sudden they see the kid with the armband and he starts singing the song. And people start joining in the Nazi song, because it sounds nice. And it kind of shatters that moment of tranquility. And that's how I was feeling in that moment. I'm having this nice dinner, and then this reminder of the danger we're all facing comes and sits down. And I look around, and people do not care about this hat. And this hat is a hat of a movement that are making direct threats on the people of Europe. Donald Trump is threatening to invade Denmark. Donald Trump has said he might side with Putin in a Russian invasion of the European Union. Donald Trump has openly waged a trade war against the European Union, against Europeans, given them these extortionate demands. Europe has humiliatingly surrendered itself. All of this wealth that these people here are making is now going to be sent across the Atlantic in tribute to Donald Trump, so that they're going to have to spend all of this money and all of the commitments in the trade deal, and also the commitments to buy American weapons that are part of that NATO plan. So these people are just sending money over to the United States in tribute because of this movement that hat represents, and nobody cares. So yeah, Europeans are living in a dream, I'd say.
I hope you're finding this interesting. If so, please do give the video a like and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much. And now back to the video. I mean, I think you touched on a point that really fascinated me as well, about what we have seen about the Trump policy towards Europe, which I thought was horrifically misguided. But now looking at it and the points that you're raising paid off, that this extortion, because in many ways it looked like earlier this year Europe was finally getting its act together and realizing the danger it was facing, and that I felt that Vance and Trump had overplayed their hand, that they hadn't understood the nature of that relationship, that the US is all dominant. It controls European security, and it's leveraged that to make sure that Europe is always buying US weapons and things like that. And I thought, right, we're getting to a stage, they've overplayed it. Europe's now starting to talk about, well, we need to have strategic autonomy. That's all going to come crashing down. And then the US isn't going to have those votes in the UN and things like that anymore. But it does seem that Europe has rolled over. Or is there, and I hear others saying that, yeah, look, that's publicly, they can't make the break with the United States. But behind the scenes, we are seeing a lot more movement towards strategic autonomy, and that Europe is sort of getting it's lining up its cards in the right way. From what your reaction, you're just not buying that.
Yeah, I mean, I hear this argument all the time. We have to surrender for now while we build our strength, and we just need more time. We're buying time, I keep hearing. Buying time to do what? Nothing is happening. I live in Brussels. I report on this stuff day in and day out. And I'm hearing this from, citizens out around in Europe, the ones that want to defend the actions that the EU is taking. And I'm telling them, I'm there, nothing is happening. And they had 8 years to do this. Really, people are frozen, absolutely frozen. They cannot think of what to do because the task seems so enormous. So this buying time argument, it might make sense if they were actually doing something, but they're not. And they're also afraid to take any action that might upset the Trump administration. So even if we take EU involvement in defense issues, right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we had all of these traditional taboos being crossed. Up until then, the European Union could not have any involvement in anything military for two reasons. The main one being that the UK and Eastern European countries were always afraid that EU involvement in defense would undermine NATO. The other one being that we have a couple of neutral countries that constitutionally could not be involved in military
Right.
matters. Those taboos were broken, and we started to get funding and some coordination, and that has completely gone by the wayside. No one's talking about that anymore. So those taboos were broken. We were talking about defense bonds, and it all just went away. And now all the impetus, all the focus is over at NATO. I mean, we spent the last 5 months trying to create this ridiculous, nonsensical 5% of GDP NATO military spending target, which everyone knows is impossible to meet. But Pedro Sanchez was the only leader with the courage to say it. So now they fudge it with this fake 1.5% on military adjacent spending, 3.5% on actual military spending. By the way, even the US doesn't spend 5%, it's something like 3%. And so they all commit to this to make Donald Trump happy. And Giorgia Meloni is going to build a bridge between continental Italy and Sicily as a military preparedness, which makes no sense. So this is all, they're flailing. They're not actually doing anything. And if they were doing this to buy time, I would say, okay, maybe to keep things calm, we need to do this, but nothing is happening.
There's so much more that I'd love to talk to you about, but I am aware of time. I think it brings to the obvious question is, where do things go from here? I mean, it's a little scary to think we're not even quarter of the way through the Trump administration. There is obviously a lot of talk about Donald Trump's health at the moment. So I guess that there are two parts to that. One is, or three parts. What happens if Trump continues? What happens if France takes over? And what is the thinking in Europe about, well, maybe we just see this through and the US will return back. The next government will probably be Democrat in an orientation. They tend to be more friendly towards Europe. Is that also the default mode? So I guess sort of trying to lay out a short, medium, and longer term perspective on where things might go, or at least how it's seen in Europe in as to where things might go.
Yeah, that's definitely the default mode. The default mode is just hoping that Trump drops dead. I mean, that is, they're just waiting for that, or that they can ride out this term and they're going to go back to a Biden-like presidency. There is no plan B. There is no plan B if the United States descends into civil war and literally can't defend Europe. There's no plan B if the United States invades Greenland. There's no plan B for any of the now very dramatic, but also entirely possible scenarios that could unfold here. They're just hoping for something like that Donald Trump might drop dead. But then they've got JD Vance. I mean, I think the only hope that might be there is that if the president were to pass away, there is this cult of personality around him that it's not clear if JD Vance could easily slip into those shoes. That's an unknown. But certainly he is not friendly toward Europe. And I think even his antipathy toward Europe is much more ideologically based than Donald Trump's. So Donald Trump is just kind of, petulant and throwing straps, but then clearly the European leaders can flatter him. And then he says nice things about them, like we saw in Washington 2 weeks ago. JD Vance can't be bought off with cheap flattery. And JD Vance appears to hate Europe. I mean, that speech in Munich made things pretty clear. So I think if the idea is they can just ride out Trump because they think he's not going to live through his term and that they can establish some kind of relationship with JD Vance. It could get a whole lot worse under JD Vance. But right now that is the only plan, because as long as they don't develop a European command and control structure where Europe could defend itself without the United States, it doesn't matter if they're increasing their military budgets. That's not a real movement. That's all artifice, because that's being done under a structure which America controls, and it's money being spent on American military equipment. So you don't actually change anything about the situation of Europe being dependent on an American command and control structure in any military operation to defend the continent. All you're doing is sending more money over the Atlantic. So in the end, I don't know. I mean, I'm feeling very, very pessimistic. I don't see any will for action either from the people of Europe at large, who I've been talking to all summer, or from our leaders. And really, our leaders are not getting the direction or the impetus from their voters in order to do anything, because their voters don't really understand what's happening. They are afraid to take dramatic actions because they think actually voters won't accept it, and also they'll antagonize the United States. So I don't see Europe acting anytime soon to try to prepare itself. And I think we're really sleepwalking toward a very big disaster here.
Dave, thank you so much. I mean, I'd like to end on a sort of a brighter note, but I think you've laid out a really, really clear picture, and it's been amazing talking to you. Thank you so much. As I say, you've got such an interesting insight coming from the US, and really been, one of the leading sort of correspondents on European politics, regardless of nationality. So it's been amazing to hear your views on this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk about these issues.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next one.